From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues shaping our world. I'm Mike Cosper, and today I'm sitting down with producer, filmmaker, and musician Steve Taylor to talk about the life and legacy of Steve Albini. Albini was a musician known to many as the frontman and guitar player for Shellac, among many other bands over the years, but he's best known as a producer behind some of the most influential albums of the 1990s, including bands like the Pixies, the Breeders, the Jesus Lizard, and PJ Harvey. Perhaps most famously, when Nirvana was on top of the world after the success of their album Nevermind, when they could have worked with anyone they wanted, they tapped Albini to produce their second record. For Nirvana, the choice reflected their own musical instincts. Cobain, in particular, was unhappy with the highly produced and polished sound of Nevermind. And Albini's reputation, I think especially because of those Pixies albums, was to create a studio environment and sound that was almost documentarian, to capture the sound of the band in the room rather than to push the technology of the studio. His albums tended to be raw and unpolished. There was a minimalism to the sound, minimalism to the processing of the audio, not a lot of alternate takes and overdubs, and he left a lot of rough edges and imperfections in there. That's the sound of In Utero, their second album that they made together, and from there, Albini's influence just continued to spread, both in the albums he produced and in his many, many imitators. Albini died this past week at the age of 61 years old. Steve, you had the opportunity to work with Albini. Tell me, when did you first come across his work and how did you first kind of discover who he was?
I knew, of course, about him just by virtue of being a music fan, and knew also about his reputation. He wrote a very influential piece about the music business. I don't remember, maybe in the mid-90s. And his take on the music business was less than flattering. And he was a real wordsmith. Like, he could craft a sentence like, the best journalists, and just was very cutting and persuasively sarcastic. And I remember, him comparing signing a deal with a label to something like crawling into a grave and watching the dirt hit your face. And everything he said about the, major label process was pretty true, and based on, his experience watching bands go through that process. So I admired him from that standpoint as well. When I was starting a record label, I thought a lot about what he said and tried to, within the influence that I had, try to craft a, more artist-friendly environment. And then we had signed at Squint, the label that I founded. We had signed a band called Chevelle, made up of three brothers. And they played this really ferocious hybrid of hard rock and metal. And because they were all from Chicago and we were trying to figure out the best producer, I thought of, well, man, what if we got Steve Albini to do it, since he's in Chicago as well? So I called the studio and they said, that's great. Are you a independent label or a major label? And I said, well, we're an independent label. And they said, okay, well, this is the rate per day. And if you want to stay at the studio at night, because they had some kind of dorm rooms, this is the rate. And I think at one point I said, wait, that's all it costs? And they said, yeah, that's the rate. I said, we're an independent label, but we do have money. We've got this band that's breaking sixpence none the richer. And so I don't want to portray us as someone who doesn't have any money. And they said, no, that's the rate. As I got to know Steve later in the process, I kept asking him about that. And at one point he said, hey, when are you going to stop trying to give me more money? That's the rate, right? So I think the thing that I loved about Steve Albini almost immediately is that just he was a man of principle. And I had not met many people of principle in the music business. So I was immediately drawn to that. But things started off pretty off at the beginning. We had scheduled the recording sessions, and I flew up to Chicago. And of course, I was very excited to work there and watch Steve Albini in action. We arrived the first morning, and the band arrived, but it's three brothers and only two of them showed up. And I'm like, hey, Pete and Sam, where's Joe, the bass player, your younger brother? They said, oh, we fired him last night. I said, I'm sorry, what? They said, yeah, we fired him last night. He was, being a jerk, and, we just had to get rid of him. And I said, well, so how are we going to do this? Because, Steve Albini records essentially a live band. It's not like you do a bunch of overdubs or go back and fix things or things like that. And they were like, well, we'll just record guitar and drums and figure out the bass later. So I think I was the one who had to report to Steve that, hey, sorry, we don't have a bass player. But since we've already on the clock and, since you've got schedules, I guess we just go with what we've got. And so he nodded and we went to work. And I got to say, the first maybe 2.5 days, he was almost mute. He only said the bare minimum of what had to be communicated. Everything was recorded to, I think it was 24-track analog. His board was the weirdest sounding mixing board I ever heard, because it was supposed to be it wasn't supposed to color the sound at all. He didn't use any compression. It was all mic placement and performance. And he was not there to judge performances. He wasn't a fan of multiple takes. And so it was terrifying because, all the things that I'd gotten used to as a producer, almost all that was taken away. And on top of that, Steve just wasn't communicating much at all. He wasn't really giving his opinion on whether he liked that take or not. So it felt pretty weird the first 2.5 days. And I remember on the third day, Pete and Sam and I are sitting on the couch while he's changing reels. And we're looking at a Rolling Stone article. I guess this is okay to talk about now. And Courtney Love was on the cover, I think. And so one of us said Courtney Love's name out loud, and he stopped what he was doing. He was still holding the reel-to-reel. He turned around and he delivered, like, I'm guessing, a 7-minute soliloquy on Courtney Love and just, frankly, what a despicable person she was. And he gave the reasons, which were all, verified, because I also knew her lawyer and knew she was not a pleasant person. And
a lot of this was in the press at the time. And all
it was all there anyway.
This is not breaking news necessarily.
Yeah, she was calling him at night, like leaving these long voicemails that were just full of expletives and terrible stuff. And it was all because he wasn't interested in working with her. So that was really in a weird way, that's where the ice broke. And then from then on, I think the next day, for whatever reason, he decided to look me up on the internet and decided that I was an all right guy. And so we started talking and the ice was broken, and the rest of the time was pretty fun. I'd had such a great time and was really sorry to see him go. And he told me, hey, when you get a chance, why don't you send me some of your work? And so I did. And I managed to find the letter back in 1999. I dug it up yesterday. And, I referenced some inside jokes. And then I said, you graciously asked me to send some CDs. So here they are. And I don't expect you to listen to all of it. You may not even like any of it, but I'm just sending what you asked for. But then I said, and speaking of gracious, I've got to tell you what a pleasure it was to get to hang out and watch you work. I've followed your career for a long time, and I've made a lot of notes, and I put in parentheses, imitation is the sincerest form of plagiarism, etc. But not just your recording techniques, although my engineers and my microphone collection expands every time we read a Steve Albini interview, because I loved what he did with mics. I loved the types of mics he used. Ribbon mics was one of his favorites. The way he would place them in his room, it just created a sound like no other. And I still think that first Chevelle album is far and away their best one. But of course, that's just me. But I said, I really admire the integrity you bring to your work and business. There's a verse in the Bible that says each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. It seems to me that you've done that constantly consistently in your work with bands and in the way you conduct your business. You certainly did that for Chevelle. You made it possible for them to make a great record on a limited budget, and you went far above and beyond the call of duty to make sure they were happy. And then I finished with, anyway, I don't want to get all gushy, but it's really inspiring to work with people who look out for others. I hope I can work with you again on something. And if we keep selling these Sixpence albums, I hope you'll do me the honor of charging me more next time, and signed off on it. So we stayed in touch, over the years. I think Steve Albini liked me, but he loved my friend Daniel Smith.
And Daniel Smith, Danielson family, for people who may be familiar with them as well. Yeah.
His girlfriend became his wife, Heather, not too long after we worked on Chevelle, was actually doing a documentary called Why Should the Devil Have All the Good Music? She was not a Christian, nor was Steve, but she was interested in these kind of music movements that were a thing unto themselves. I helped her out with, contacting people and tracking some people down and things like that. And so through that process, I got to know her as well. And, I'd check in with Steve periodically. But then we had an opportunity with, after Daniel did a tour with us where, he opened for us and we all hit it off famously of making an EP. And that's when we got to work with Steve again. And I will now pause since I'm doing all the talking.
No, that's great. I love those stories. I mean, I think for people who maybe weren't paying attention to it or who are too young to have sort of lived through it, talk about, I mean, there really was, everybody always talks about how the music industry changed in the 90s. They changed, Nevermind kind of blew up a whole era, a whole sound and all that. I mean, Nevermind certainly did change everything, but it really was In Utero that kind of changed the sound of everything. There was such a night and day difference between those two records. And it was like, that was the first time the world really heard what Nirvana actually sounded like. They didn't, all the chorusing guitars and the big, the big stereo mixes and all that kind of stuff. That was not what you experienced at a Nirvana show. They were a punk rock band essentially. And that was the world that Albini really came from. I mean, you were a musician during all of that. Like, what was it like to sort of to feel the winds change in those years? And how important was he to all of that?
Steve's influence is hard to overstate. And like you said, a lot of it came from the difference between Nevermind and In Utero. And I remember when I listened to In Utero the first time, because, like everybody on the planet, I was a pretty major Nirvana fan. I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. And it all made sense when I saw him working, because he was just into the sound of the band and wanted as little processing as possible, meaning almost zero. It was all about capturing the band's essence with where you put the microphones and using the right room. In Utero, to me, is their masterpiece. But it was so shocking that certainly the record label was not into it. And you probably know that they even had Scott Litt, who was REM's engineer and mixer, mix some of the tracks on In Utero, because I think they just sounded, the sound was just too foreign from what people had become used to. And that was part of the appeal of working with Steve, but it was also, part of the danger of working with Steve is you're going to get the sound that he creates in that room. And, to then go and remix what he had already done was kind of like not cool. And frankly, I encountered the same problem because Chevelle was not prepared for the sound that he created. And they really wanted someone else to remix the album. And I fought them for a long time and then finally said, look, if you want to do that, you need to talk to Steve personally and tell him what you're doing and ask him if that's okay. And they did. And he graciously said, that was fine. But I still felt like it was kind of a betrayal of the whole reason that we'd worked with Steve Albini to begin with.
I had some friends who were in a Louisville band, and they recorded with Albini, and their manager got in touch with them, 4 or 5 months before they went to work with him. Their label had booked everything. It was their first record with like a big studio, a big name, and all of this. And when they got Albini on the phone, they were like, he was like, how should I get them to prepare? And he was like, well, I mean, if they want to prepare means play the songs 500 times and they should be fine. That was it. That was all he did. And their description, my friend, I talked to him yesterday, is his description of working with him was very similar to what you said. He said very, very little. It was all about the mics and all this. And they also felt, he said what we didn't like was we felt exposed on the recordings because it's like there's no hiding. And with other ways of recording, with digital recording and everything like that, like you can go and you can edit like crazy and all of this. But with what Albini does, you're talking about the microphones. Part of it is that because he's capturing the sound of the room, you don't isolate everything. You can't edit and move things around. What you play is what you get. And so as you know, as musicians, they were like, oh wow, we actually have to play these songs,
right.
which is, you know, just how it used to be. But that was kind of the ethic with him that I think was so interesting. I did actually meet him once. We ran a venue in Louisville when I was in ministry. We ran this venue called the 930 Arts Center. And we hosted a tribute show. There was a Louisville musician named Jason Noble who passed away. He was in all kinds of great bands over the years, the Rachels and all these, the Shipping News. And they did a fundraiser for his wife when he died, and Shellac was the headliner for it. And
you got to see Shellac at your club?
Oh yeah.
Oh my gosh.
It was incredible. And so I was there when they were loading in, and he came over and introduced it. He asked if I was a sound guy, and I said, no, I'm here, you know, working with the venue, but the sound guy will be here in a little bit. And he goes, well, you won't really need mics for the amps or anything like that. He's like, we basically just turn everything up. And I was like, okay, you know. And he goes, have you been to a Shellac show before? And I said, no, I have. Or I said, I've been to an outdoor show. I've never seen you in a club environment or anything. Yeah. And he goes, it'll be the loudest effing show you've ever seen. And he was right. It was because he had like 2 high watt, you know, full stacks just cranked wide open in this very small room. And man, I mean, it's the Steve Albini sound. I listened to that Chevelle record this morning thinking about you working with him, and I was like, oh, that's like the shellac guitar sound. It's just that wall of sound, you know, guitar from another world kind of thing. So yeah, I think
Chevelle was with me when we went to see Shellac at a club not too far away, and I don't know if he was still doing that when you saw him, but they didn't have any roadies. Like they loaded everything themselves. They loaded it out themselves. Yeah, they didn't have a sound man. It was just the 3 of them traveling in a van with a trailer. And I mean, obviously he could have afforded a few roadies and a little more creature comforts, but man, he just had certain principles and he stuck by those, and it's really admirable, man. I'm just so sad that he's gone.
61 is too young for anybody. So yeah. Well, again, Steve, thanks for joining us for this. Thanks for joining us for this conversation, and thanks to all of you for listening. We'll be back.